I'm John Throckmorton with Tomo Drug Testing, been with them about 17 years, and it's our privilege to be a part of this meeting this morning. Now we're going to be talking about drug and alcohol testing in the workplace, all right? And there's a lot of things going on, but if you want to know the direction we're going to go, there's the 6 points we're going to really focus on. And don't worry about me because I like to wander around aimlessly as I talk, all right? And don't feel bad about interrupting me because I'm happy to take those questions. The first thing we like to ask when we do a presentation is the why. Now there's two parts to that why. The first one is, why are you here? Well, you come to learn some things, but you had the agenda in advance, right? So you knew kind of the topic that we were going to be talking about. Could I ask you this question? Knowing that we're going to talk about drug and alcohol testing in the workplace, are there any specific questions that you have that you say, I sure hope we talk about these questions because I've been wondering about those? And so now's the time that you get to feedback. Questions? Yes? So basically, recreational marijuana and its impact on you as an employer. What else? Yes, sir. Okay, so you're referring to the OSHA ruling about a year or so ago that really put a limitation on after-accident testing. Okay, good deal. What else? Yes, ma'am. Okay, the question was the cost to the employee for an employee assistance program should somebody test positive and the company offers the opportunity for rehabilitation. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started then. Why do we do drug and alcohol testing? Well, let's make it real. You look at this picture and you probably don't know this young lady, but she might remind you of someone that you do know. What's significant about her? That was her SUV. She did not survive this incident. Now look at the name slapped on the side of that van. And the question would be, could that be any one of your company's names? Could it be one of your company vehicles? And the answer to that question would be, yes, it very much could be. Now what we're hoping is that the driver of your vehicle is not conducting himself in the same fashion as the driver of that vehicle. Because what do you notice in that very first paragraph about the driver of that van? They've been smoking pot all day long. And if you go down a few more paragraphs, you'll notice that he was not alone in that van. Now, if this company had a very aggressive and very active substance abuse testing program, and those new employees riding with them were encouraged to say, hey, look, we value safety. We value our employees, and so therefore, here's our policies if you notice someone might be demonstrating characteristics or blatantly smoking in your presence. Apparently they didn't have anything like that because those guys rode along all day and said they were going to say something at the end of the day. My question, was this a preventable accident? Absolutely. So when we do drug and alcohol testing, there's really one main thing that we're trying to protect, and that's what? One word, starts with the letter S, ends with the letter Y. Many of you have it in your title. Safety. Drug and alcohol testing is a safety issue. What's been happening around our world? Well, here's some recent headlines and some free information. There's a company called Current Consulting Group out of Florida. They are an excellent resource for state drug and alcohol testing regulations. How many of your organizations only operate in Missouri? Okay. How many of your organizations operate in multiple states? Those of you who operate in multiple states, did you know that your drug and alcohol testing policy has to be unique to each state in which you operate? Okay? Which means you could have quite a few drug and alcohol testing policies. These guys are some great resources to help you make sure that policy is current and up to date. But these are just some headlines that came out. And I'm seeing more and more headlines. What's the one headline that we're seeing almost daily in the news? Opioids. Yeah. The crisis, the epidemic, things of that nature. One of the printed articles I got talks about an elephant tranquilizer, carfentanil, that they're using I think that it says like it's 50 times the strength, or is it 50 or 500 times the strength of morphine. I mean, it'll just knock you out. A little bit the size of maybe the tenth of a penny is enough to kill you. And yet people are mixing that with heroin and cocaine on the streets, and it's making it very, very dangerous. So why are we doing drug and alcohol testing? Because the reality of it is, it's out there in the workplace. Why do you test? Well, you may be required to do so under federal regulations. Do any of you fall under Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration drug and alcohol testing guidelines? One, okay. Anybody under FTA or FAA? Pipeline, okay. So some of you are mandated to do drug and alcohol testing. Some of you might be highly motivated by your insurance providers. Okay, I've seen that happen where you're strongly encouraged. Matter of fact, some insurance providers offer financial incentives if you have a substance abuse testing program and you're actively pursuing that. So those are some reasons also for testing. It could be a safety, a loss prevention issue. It could be productivity. Do drugs have an impact on somebody's ability to do their job? Is it usually positive or negative? Depends on who you ask. If you ask the person, it could be a very positive effect, all right? But on the other hand, for most employers, it is negative. Because if you got somebody who's kind of strung out on methamphetamine while they're high, they're going to work like a rabbit, and they're going to go a mile a minute. Cocaine's the same thing. We had a company once, this was a manufacturer, who back in the warehouse, they stacked their pallets about 15 foot high, about 8 foot apart. A couple supervisors went back there one morning, and guess what they found? Two guys high on cocaine, thinking they were Superman, trying to jump from the top of one pallet to the top of the next pallet, because they thought they could. I don't know. Does that sound like a safety issue? Okay. But if a company doesn't have a drug and alcohol testing program, is there a lot they can do about that? I've got to keep that in mind. And then what's your organizational culture and what are your values? I've had some employers tell me, I can't afford to establish a drug and alcohol testing program because if I did, I would lose half of my employees. Well, duh. You know, how much is it going to cost you if one of those employees has an incident and turns out to be high on something, and then you get your bejeebies sued? You know, how much is a drug test compared to that lawsuit? And not only financial values, but the cost of the reputation of your company. So sometimes you have to weigh it on both ends. Why do we do testing? Well, it has a financial impact on you. It's going to lower productivity. It's going to increase the risk for accidents. So what goes up? Work comp rates on insurance rates, healthcare costs all go up. You usually have people who don't come in as often because they're hungover. They just don't feel like coming in. So the bottom line, what's impacted by substance abuse in the workplace in your business? Your bottom line, right? Alcohol. Your company policy needs to have some specific things. Now, you'll hear us say a lot about company policy, and this is important because your policy establishes the guidelines under which you can do substance abuse testing. And I've seen some policies that say things like, okay, you can't come to work under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And if you do, that's a no-no. That's all it says. So then the company calls us and says, we would like you to come out and do some drug and alcohol testing. And I've been doing it too long, I ask questions. I shouldn't, but I do. Okay, what does your policy say? They read it to me. I'm like, what I'm not hearing is a provision for testing, like pre-employment or reasonable suspicion. Well, it's not in there. Do you know what? You got a dog that has no teeth. There's no bite. You have no legal provision to test a person until you rewrite your policy. And then once you get that policy written, what are things that are in it? For example, what is if the employee has an alcohol concentration excess of your company's cutoff level, what is your company's specified cutoff level for alcohol? You say, what do you mean? Well, how much alcohol can you have in your system and still come to work? I've seen some policies written that says you can't come into work under the influence of alcohol. So in your mind, if that's the statement in a policy, what level of alcohol do you think that means? Any, 0, 0, 0. But could it be argued that that could be legally drunk? which is 0.8. And who's going to argue what the level of alcohol concentration is? The courts. But if you have something in your policy that says if you're 0.02 or greater, if you're 0.00 or greater, if you're 0.04 or greater, now you have a specified level and you're saying if I'm at that level or above, I'm in violation of the company's policy. So what is your stated level of violation for alcohol? All right? Yes? The question was, when we check for alcohol, are we doing breath, blood, or urine? We'll get to that in a minute, but we do breath alcohol testing. I guarantee you, you do not want me doing blood. The best I can do, I carry a pocket knife with me. All right? And urine, some people use it. We feel it's the least reliable method for detecting alcohol. So we generally use a breath alcohol device. Do you want the technical? It's on the conforming products list of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Blah, 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 blah. And we do that because we have to meet federal standards. We do a lot of federally mandated testing under DOT guidelines. Great question. All right. How often in your company can you drink on the job? How many of you would say never? Okay. Define for me what it means to be on duty. Because, number one, how many of your companies have salespeople? All right. Do your salespeople go out and do they entertain clients? Are they considered to be on the job? Are they entertaining those clients by maybe having a drink or two with them? Have they just violated your company policy? Oh. How many of you ever gone to conferences like this, where maybe it's an all-day thing, and at the end of the day they have a reception or social hour? And what's a common offering at those social hours? Alcohol. When you're at the conference, are you on duty or off duty? So if you drink at the conference and you're on duty, have you just violated your company's policy? So I ask that question because you have to think through that a little bit. And if I leave a conference and I've had a couple beers and I get involved in an accident and I'm at the conference representing my company, can they come back on the company? So take a look at your policy. And if it has a statement that says you can't drink while on duty, what does on duty mean? And it may be in this day and age, you want to give that a little bit clearer definition. And then also, make sure in your policy, how many of you do testing after accidents? All right? So, in most companies, you can do testing for about 8 hours after an accident for alcohol, 32 for drug. Your question, can you even do post-accident testing? OSHA has been so wishy-washy. They have never given clarity on that. The one thing that our consultants have encouraged, and maybe you've already done this, but our consultants have really encouraged a stronger emphasis on reasonable suspicion recognition. And so in the past, a company may have 1 or 2 people that have been trained to know what to look for, signs and symptoms of somebody being under the influence. They are doubling, tripling, quadrupling that. They are putting a lot of emphasis on that training, so their eyes and ears. The other thing that we learned was that most policies were being dinged because they had this blanket policy. It said if you're involved in an accident, you're going to get tested. And now they're encouraged to get with their legal counsel to really give very specific meaning to that. What accidents do constitute a testable incident? Now, obviously, if you are covered by federal regulations, in many instances, that's already spelled out depending on the type of accident. But it really goes back to giving details to your policy and then putting a stronger emphasis on reasonable suspicion. Those are the 2 main things because OSHA still has not given us a lot of clarity on that situation. That makes sense? Okay, super. I got one, Shayna. I got one question. All right, so I got to just make sure I get these done. Any questions on prohibitions regarding alcohol? Oh, now we have another one. Okay. Ooh, that is a good question. So you as a company have a social function, and you as a company provide alcohol to your clients and attendees, and they get a little knockered. Are you responsible for those actions? I'm going to defer that to your legal counsel. in all seriousness, you need to have that conversation with them. And what is your liability for that? Because I know as an employer, I've seen court cases where if I knowingly have an employee who's had issues with alcohol and then they're out driving and they are involved in an accident, when the lawsuit comes in, it's the individual, but it also goes up the ladder to the company because they knowingly allowed that person to continue on with an issue like that and didn't deal it. But I've not really seen articles about attendees being under the influence. So I would really say it'd be a good question for your legal counsel. And I appreciate that question because I've really never been asked it before. Anything else? How does alcohol impact you? Well, if you look at this list, on the left-hand side, you got increasing levels of intoxication, but on the right-hand side, you got increasing levels of impairment. Question, is that the same for everybody? No, all right? So people could be at the first couple levels and acting like the third or fourth level, but could somebody be at the third or fourth level acting like the first or second level? Absolutely. You got functioning alcoholics that can really function very well. Matter of fact, early on in my career doing this, I had a gentleman test at a .215 at 7:30 in the morning. I thought, my soul, sir, what did you put on your Rice Krispies? He was a functioning alcoholic. You want to know the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say? He was known as one of the best heavy equipment operators in southwest Missouri at that level of intoxication. It's when he was sober that he was worthless because he was going through the shakes and everything else like that. I actually had the privilege of going back and doing his return to duty test, going back to the question about that. And just since I'm on it real quick, it depends on how extensive the rehab. What I'm normally going to see is probably anywhere from $500 to $2,500 for the rehab program, and then it depends on how extensive your follow-up and return to duty testing program is. If you're guided by federal testing, once a person returns to duty, they have to do at least 6 tests in the 12 months after they return to duty. They could be tested for as long as 60 months. It's up to the substance abuse professional who does the evaluation. Otherwise, your company policy specifies. So you might say, I'm subject to testing for 12 months, 24 months, but there should always be a written agreement between yourself and the employee saying these are the terms of the agreement. Usually if you violate it a second time, you're terminated, no questions asked. But kudos if you're offering that, because a lot of people are putting a stronger emphasis on rehab and trying to get people to recover. But probably anywhere from $500 to $2,500 would be kind of an average range. All right, now, in that first level, 0.01 to 0.05, it says mostly normal behavior but could be considered moderately impaired. So if I'm acting relatively normal, what in the world is moderate impairment? Your thought. This is where you get to jump in. Hello? What's moderate impairment? Take a guess. What's that? 0.0. Well, I mean, how would I be demonstrating moderate impairment? Delayed responsiveness. That's exactly right. A delayed in your reaction time. Now, if you're zipping down the road at 60 miles an hour, how many feet per second are you traveling? Good. I'm glad somebody's looking at the slide. Because believe it or not, I've had classes where I saw one class where a guy pulled out a piece of paper and was trying to do longhand math to figure that one out. So if you're going 88 feet a second, and let's say you've had a couple beers, because on average, any of us who drinks one beer, a 12-ounce can of beer, it's going to delay our reaction time for about a second for maybe an hour. So a couple beers, a 2-second delay. You had a couple beers, you jump in the car, you're driving down the road. Something jumps out in front of you. How far are you going to travel before your foot even moves to the brake pedal? 176 feet. Could that be the difference between preventing or creating an accident? Okay. So class, what's the lesson we learned from that? There you go. Don't drink and drive, or at least allow enough time for that alcohol to get out of your system. Now look at the next level, 0.03 to 0.12. Mild euphoria, increased self-confidence, lower inhibitions. So at this level, what am I doing? There you go. So give me examples of things that you might see people doing at this level. You're shaking your head, so talking loud. Okay, what else? okay? Or jumping up on the table and starting to dance, right? Now, somebody in one class said, well, you're dancing. I said, well, if that's the case, my wife would love it because I've taken lessons and I still can't dance, all right? But at this level of intoxication, people often don't feel like they're genuinely impaired. So I'd like to do a demonstration as to what it's like to be at this level of intoxication. But to do so, I need a volunteer. So here's our first opportunity for a volunteer to volunteer. And if no one volunteers to volunteer, who gets to pick the volunteer? So are you volunteering? All right, Casey, come on up. Give her a hand. Appreciate that. And Casey, for volunteering, when we're done here, go ahead and have some fruit on me. Okay, no problem. All right, so here's what we're going to do. I want to make sure that you're operating relatively normal right now, so I'm simply going to ask you to walk to me. Excellent job. Appreciate that. All right, thank you very much. You did a good job. Now, if you go back to where you started at, and what I'm going to do is ask Casey to put on a pair of beer goggles. Now, these beer goggles have a visual equivalency of a 0.07 to 0.10, kind of right in the middle of where we're at there. How you feeling, Casey? Awesome. What scares me is when I have somebody in the crowd do this and they put them on, they go, okay. I don't think you're doing that though, right? All right, same exercise. Please walk to me. Okay, stop. Well, appreciate that. Thank you. All right, good job. Take those things off. Go ahead and have a seat. Give her a hand again. Now, Casey, how did you feel? Super drunk, all right? Now, this is just right around the legal limit of being drunk. It'd probably take maybe 3 beers to get Casey to this level of intoxication. The problem is every time we give her one of those beers, her brain slowly adjusts to it because when she put these glasses on, her immediate brain reaction was, this isn't right, I'm going to make some adjustments. And I'll tell you what, if you promise to get these back, I'm going to pass these around and let you see what Casey saw, okay? The only thing I'll suggest is that don't reach for an open container, all right? But every time I give Casey one of those beers, her brain's going to adjust. So by the time she gets that 3rd beer in her and we say, Casey, tell you what, why don't you give us your keys and we'll have somebody take you home? What's she going to say? I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with me. And so understand, and we do a lot of supervisor drug and alcohol recognition training. And some of these things will just be intermixed, but that's a good tool, eye-hand coordination, that you can use to help demonstrate. One of the things, and it's too big a room for everybody to see this, but as you get close to your table, pick up your pen without the glasses on, and then put the glasses on and try to pick up your pen, and notice how you do it differently. As a supervisor, if you do reasonable suspicion testing, that eye-hand coordination is a great tool that you can use. Because in your culture, a handshake may not be a common occurrence. You know, if you walk up to somebody and offer to shake their hand, they may look at you and think, hey, what's wrong with you? But if you ask them to pick up a piece of paper or a pen, well, that's a common request. And just watching how they do it. Because most people just go right for it and pick it up. But I've seen so many crazy things with the glasses on. People will go very slow or they'll miss or whatever. One guy, my favorite is the claw effect. Okay, you've seen these games in arcades or whatever, the big claw and it goes out, opens up, drops down and grabs whatever's in front of it. Well, people try to pick up that pen the second time. Out goes the hand, the claw opens, slaps it down, and grabs it. They got it, but it was definitely different than what they did the first time. All right. How's it accumulate and dissipate? Size, gender, tolerance for alcohol, what you drink, all those factors come into play. A drink in our world is 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, or a shot of hard liquor. Now, who's my gentleman in this room who is 170 pounds? Or relatively close? Okay. Jeff, you okay if I use you for illustrative purposes only? All right? I will not embarrass you in any fashion, I don't think. All right? But you take a guy Jeff's size and you give him a drink. On average, that drink is going to elevate his alcohol concentration somewhere between 0.01 to 0.02. It's going to take about an hour for that drink to dissipate out of his system. So, Jeff, what time do you normally have to show up for work in the morning? 7 o'clock in the morning. You get off at what time? 5 o'clock. So, and you don't work on Saturdays, right? All right, so this is a weekday. This is not Friday. This is Wednesday. And Wednesday after work, Jeff goes home. And you said you have to be at work at 7 o'clock? So between 6 and 7 o'clock, Jeff puts down a 6-pack of beer, a couple shots, and a couple glasses of wine. Now, again, it scares me when somebody says, okay. But based upon our rate of dissipation, if he knocks off at 7 o'clock tonight, or that night, what's the earliest that would be out of his system the next day? 10 drinks means how many hours? 10 hours. He knocks off at 7 o'clock in the morning, so it would be 5 o'clock, okay? And you show up for work at 7? So, woohoo! Bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and ready to go, right? I had a guy in one class thought for a moment, he goes, well, I could have had 2 more drinks. Just doing the math in his head, all right? What does that mean? Well, if Jeff stayed out till 2 o'clock in the morning and drank the same amount of alcohol between 1 and 2 o'clock and then showed up for work at 7, would there be issues? Yeah, it's something you'd want to deal with because there's not enough time to get out of your system. Also, another thing I want to, question? Another thing, what's the picture of? A mixed drink, all right? Here's a rule of thumb, and this is something you might want to communicate with your staff. It's not how many drinks you order, it's how many drinks are in that drink that you order. So we have a social hour. We're off duty, all right? And I bring out a whole tray full of 16-ounce margaritas. Would anyone enjoy one of those margaritas? Remember, we're off duty. Anyone? I see you shaking your head. Okay. So what was your name again? Sherry. Sherry has a 16-ounce margarita. How many drinks does she just drink? On average, 4. On average, 4. So she has 2 of those margaritas and decides to drive home, and she gets pulled over, and the officer says, ma'am, how much have you had to drink? What's her answer going to be? 2? Because you had 2 of them, right? You drank 2. But how many drinks did she actually drink? 8. So rather than being good to drive in maybe 3-4 hours, stay home, call Uber, do whatever, because it's probably going to be about 12 to 14 hours before you should even think about driving. So remember, it's not how many drinks you order, but how many drinks are in that drink. Drugs. I think we're on point number 3. Is it legal to do drugs in your company? Yes? It's a very open question, isn't it? All right? Drugs have an impact upon safety. All right? It can affect a lot of people in a lot of different ways. Now, question. Are there non-drug related issues that could cause a person to show the same characteristics? Absolutely. All right? Drugs can affect the way what you wear. It can affect your physical appearance, not only by clothing, but also by your external appearance. Personal grooming can be impacted. I've actually had about 5 or 6 classes where there was a gentleman sitting in the class that looked like the gentleman in the picture. Talk about a hoot, okay? If I walked in as an employee and my eyes looked like this, would you have any concerns? What would you do? What's that? Monitor, okay? Well, how would you monitor? Okay, so are you just going to, all day long, just kind of, hi, Marietta, how are you? I think Amber would, I think I did this to you when I first started doing this, but I started getting some of this training, and Amber was younger than she is today, and she was still at home, and so sometimes she'd come in, I'd go, well, hi, how are you doing today? You know, how was school today? And I think finally she said, Dad, get out of my face. So, but, you know, sometimes we can get carried away on that. But if my eyes look like that, you're absolutely right. I'm going to want to spend some time around that person to see what's going on. Pay attention to the signs that a person could be demonstrating, because there are behavioral issues that could change if somebody gets strung out on substance abuse. What do you include in your drug test and your policy? Do you know the drugs that are included? Do you know what it doesn't do? So as we talk about drugs, we're going to throw some things out there that you really need to consider, because since 2013, the second most common reason for a positive drug test in our industry has been prescription medications. And yet most policies that I read have a very weak or non-existent statement regarding the use of a legitimately prescribed medication that has a performance inhibiting factor attributed to it. And it's interesting, a recent article from the National Safety Council. Prescription drug misuse impacts over 70% of U.S. workplaces. Now, the article didn't say illicit drug use. It said prescription drug misuse. And I'm going to characterize that and say sometimes even prescription drug usage. Because if somebody's taking a legitimately prescribed medication, could that still impair their ability to safely perform certain duties? Absolutely. How does your company policy address that? Now, you look there, if you follow their federal guidelines, there are 5 drugs that test for. If you want to go outside that realm of 5 drugs, then you have to go into what's called a drug-free workplace policy. And again, it's very important that you have a policy specific to each DOT administration that you are subject to, as well as each state in which you operate. So some companies may have 2, 3, 4 different policies. They might have one for DOT, one minute DOT administration, a second for another DOT administration, a drug-free workplace. You know, as you evaluate your policy, and it should be something you do at least every year or 2, make sure that your policy is reflective of your practices. Is there anyone here from MEM? Okay. We work a lot with Missouri Employers Mutual, and especially when it comes to those work comp denials, one of the things that they've emphasized to us and they've emphasized in seminars is that your policy and your practices need to be consistent. And there's too many times where I've read through policies say, yeah, well, our policy says this, but we don't. The minute you start doing that, you open up the door for conflict. And if that can be proven, MEM said, we have a hard time standing behind you. So make sure your policies and your practices are consistent. Do you understand what a synthetic drug is? You've heard of things like K2, bath salts, that kind of stuff? Okay. Marijuana, that's a great question. That's where we have the greatest amount of positives in our industry. And you can see some pictures of what it looks like, paraphernalia associated with the usage of it. But people can get very, very good at hiding what they're using to ingest. There's a lot of things going on with marijuana. You can see how they'll make just a bracelet to be some type of smoking device. A lot of crazy things that they're using. If somebody's been using marijuana, here's some of the characteristics that you might look for. Does anyone not know what a Roach Clip is? No, seriously. If I say Roach Clip, no clue what we're talking about. Okay? You don't? Okay. 2 of you don't? Okay. Does anyone have one with them that they can? Well, wait a minute. I'm sure you do. Does anybody have in their purse a set of tweezers? Okay. Well, I'd use that more for snorting my cocaine than I would my marijuana. But okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, they're in the pen. Okay, yeah, I can stick my joint in that. Okay. Basically, a Roach Clip is anything that somebody uses to clip onto that joint and smoke it down as much as far as they possibly can. Now, I was doing a session similar to this for a school district. And when I walked in the first thing in the morning, in front of each person, there was a little 5-inch figurine of a school mascot with a 4-inch metal rod sticking out of its back and an alligator clip soldered onto the end. I thought, this will be cool. All right, I got a little feisty on this one. So, a couple introductory remarks and I said, I'm concerned. You invited us here to speak about drug and alcohol recognition techniques, and it appears that the school board has given you all Roach Clips at the beginning of the school year. I don't understand this. And they're looking at me going, what are you talking about? And I said, what are those little things in front of you? Oh, no, we put them on our desk. We put our business cards in there. We put pictures on there. They're not Roach Clips. I said, they certainly are Roach Clips. A couple coaches were sitting in the back of the room, and they looked at those things again, and they looked at me, and they go, yeah, they're Roach Clips, all right. Who would have thunk? And yet, users are very good at all alternative means of ingestion that may not be a common indicator to you. So be aware that they can do stuff like that. Let's go back and let's talk to marijuana a little bit. Is all marijuana the same? Okay. Remember the picture of Grandma and Grandpa Hippie a few slides ago? Okay. What was the big event that took place when they were younger? Woodstock. Okay. How many of you were alive when Woodstock was actually happening? Okay, there were a few of us. Did anybody attend? I think I've had one person in the class actually was there at Woodstock, okay? But if we were to zip back to Woodstock and we were to pick up some marijuana from that time, on average, what percentage of THC, that's the active ingredient that we test for, what percentage of THC would be in that marijuana? %3 or less. 3% or less. Now, growing up, okay, I'm preteen at that time frame, but my impression of people smoking marijuana were the hippies, okay? The long, flowy, flowery dresses and that kind of stuff, and the headbands, and you smoke a joint, and then you go loping through the flower fields, you know, and you're on this wonderful, mellow-like high. That's 3% or less THC. The average THC concentration today is around 12.5 to 15%. Now, at 12%, according to Ed Moses, who's with ACT Mo and used to be is a retired undercover cop for the Highway Patrol, at 12%, it starts really, really messing with your mind. Now, stop and think about this, because you can pick up stuff out of Alaska that's somewhere between 30 to 35 THC. You can go to Colorado into a hookah bar and get a concoction that could be 40 to 60% THC. How many of you have ever heard of something called dabs or shatter, wax, honey? Do you know what it is? Or have you just heard of it? Saw a hand back there. You know what it is? You have a teenage daughter. Do you know how to make it? Okay. Dabs, you're right, is a very highly concentrated form of marijuana. They usually take butane gas. They pour it over top the marijuana, let it trickle down through, and catch it in a pan in the bottom. They then let the butane evaporate, and what's left is something that's a tar-like, honey-like consistency, and a little dab on the fingertip on the tip of their tongue. And the articles I've read have said it's so concentrated, it could be 60 to 90% THC. It's so concentrated that the regular users are not prepared for the impact it has on them. One of the workforce task people in Republic was sharing with us some of the impacts that dabs had. So if you start hearing people talking about the dabs or the shatter, they're messing with stuff that's highly concentrated THC. Question: a Missouri worker takes a vacation to a certain western state that may have been mentioned earlier to go skiing. And while they're in that state, they indulge in what that state now legally allows, and they come back to Missouri. That shows up because you do a random or post-accident drug test. Is that a legitimate positive? How many say yes? How many say no? How many didn't raise their hand? Okay. So, how does recreational marijuana and all that impact? Well, right now, the courts have been upholding the employer's right to test for marijuana and to discipline, because marijuana is still considered a Schedule I drug. So therefore, it is federally illegal. And state laws technically don't trump that. Now, under federal testing guidelines for Department of Transportation, a positive is a positive is a positive. I just pulled an article off regarding THC, and this was just yesterday. It says litigation surrounding marijuana will continue to plague employers unless laws are tightened. And the whole article said that it goes back to your policy. How well written is it? How clearly it is defined? How do you address performance inhibiting factors? So, can you use marijuana recreationally? You can. Could it bring a lawsuit? It's starting to, and the courts are starting to fight that thing out. Should you remove marijuana from your testing protocols? Well, let me ask you this. Do you want someone at work under the influence? Even if they legalize it, is it a performance inhibiting drug? So here's a couple things, and we may be jumping ahead a little bit, but you're absolutely right. When you're using a standard urine drug test, the window of detection for marijuana could be 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months. It really depends on the amount of ingestion, the strength of what ingested, the person's metabolism, things like that. So it is a myth to say that if I smoke a joint, I'll test positive for the next 30 days. If I smoke 27 joints, that could be. But the scientists at the laboratory will tell us we can't determine when it happened. So some of the testing methodologies that are out there now can assist. For example, oral fluid testing, saliva testing. The window of detection for saliva, or for drugs in saliva, is no more than 1 to 2 days for any drug. So with a saliva test, if somebody fails for marijuana, it's an indication that they've smoked within the last 14 to 48 hours. So that helps narrow it down. Now, they were doing some studies over in England with different types of oral collection devices. And I think there was another one, I read an article, I'm trying to remember recently, where they were doing some test, almost like a breath test. And they were finding some success. Matter of fact, I think it was Michigan that they were trying out in 5 counties in Michigan. They were using a breath device to determine drug intoxication. And they were able to pick up certain tests, but it's still in an experimental stage. So again, that's where a lot of times for work comp it's an issue, because did the drug have an impact or potentially cause the accident? Alcohol, it's a lot easier to determine. The drugs, you're absolutely right, it's not. Exactly. I mean, they can come up with a nanogram per milliliter, but they don't know, if the life of the drug is still impacting the person's performance. The oral fluid testing can help narrow that window down. But there's certain things that you have to know about state regulations. Here in Missouri, you might be able to use oral fluid for post-accident. You may not be able to use it for work comp denial. There's some real challenges in the regulations. So it's getting with your attorneys, getting with your legislators, and getting that stuff cleared. And unfortunately, what happened in Colorado and a lot of states that these pass, they pass the medical marijuana stuff, and then they try to figure out the details afterwards. Here's another concern with marijuana. This came back, I think it was early this year, August or July. Out in California, they did some studies, and they said that 80% of the medical marijuana that they tested in California was tainted with mold, fungus, bacteria, pesticides, or harmful solvents. 80% of the medical marijuana distributed at these dispensaries was tainted in some fashion. And the article goes on to talk about how that impacts those who are smoking that, even for legitimate medical conditions. I mean, if you've got a respiratory issue and you're smoking marijuana tainted with pesticides, is that a problem? Absolutely. What is the regulatory guidelines for the production of marijuana used for medicinal purposes? He raised his hand. 0. There are none. Now, I had a doctor in one seminar said, how many medications do you know that do not have to go through FDA clearance before they are prescribed? And his second question was, how many medications do you know that the means of ingestion is by smoking? So he was basically saying, it's not all about quote-unquote medical marijuana. And as you study it a little bit more, there are a lot of different ingredients that are used, that are in marijuana. THC is just one of the ingredients. CBD, cannabinol, those kind of things. They do have certain, I would say medicinal but beneficial properties, but they don't have the THC in it. They don't have the active psychoactive ingredient. So can you use some of these products? Potentially. They're not illegal. The only thing that we were told in some of the studies that we researched was that to generally be considered CBD, it has to have, I think, 0.03% or less of THC in it. How are you going to know that if it's not regulated? And a lot of the stuff coming from overseas, they don't pay any attention. They just crunch it up, shoot it out. No. What exactly? In any type of standard drug test, each drug has a cutoff level. And the cutoff level is the amount that you have to get to or above to prompt further testing. So the standard federal cutoff level for marijuana is 50 nanograms per milliliter, which is made up of a number of different marijuana metabolites. But when they do confirmation testing, they hone it down to just that one metabolite, the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. And there has to be at least 15 nanograms of that or above. Now that's federal guidelines, which means this. If you walk by somebody who's you're at a party and you walk by somebody who's been smoking marijuana and they blow a puff of smoke in your face, should you be concerned you might fail your drug test? Probably not. They did a study in the Netherlands. They put 4 guys in a Volkswagen van. They let 3 of the guys smoke as much as they wanted. And some of us old-timers are reminiscing about a Cheech and Chong movie, okay? But the 4th guy in that environment took between 3 to 5 hours to test positive. So if an employee says, well, I was at a party, man, and somebody blew smoke in my face, and that must be why I failed my drug test, what are they really just saying? They've been smoking, or everybody who was smoking, they went up to them and went, what's that you're smoking, man? That's kind of different. And they did it for 4 or 5 hours. Basically, they are around it long enough that they tested positive and they got a high. So you can from secondhand smoke. It just takes a little bit longer. One of the things I don't like to see in policies would be a statement that says, we may test pre-employment, or we may test after an accident. It's like, you either are or you aren't. You know, be very, very, so there's sometimes that may could come in, like for a random testing statement, we generally recommend a statement along the lines of, we're going to test at the frequency and volume that we deem appropriate to ensure a safe and productive work environment. What does that mean? We can test as often as we want. We can test as many people as we want. Versus, we're going to test 10% of our workforce each quarter. Well, now what have you done? Well, it's like playing poker with your hand held backwards. You just told everybody. So if you're going to test people 10% a quarter and you test in October, what does that mean for November and December? Party on, yeah, because we can't test you. But if we say as often and as much, well, then if I test on October 1st, can I test on October 2nd? Absolutely. If I test 2 people on October 1st, could I test 27 people on October 2nd? Absolutely. I'm not defining my frequency and volume. We're just letting you know we're going to test as often and as much as we want. Also, please, 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 don't call us and ask us to come out and test randomly 3 people. I've had that happen. So, again, I ask questions. Do you mind if I ask why you're wanting us to come test these 3 people? Well, we're worried about number B, letter B. I always pick B, Sherry, so it's not on you, okay? We're worried about B, but we don't want B to know we're worried about him, so we're going to pick A, B, and C and test all of them. And by the way, would you mark this as a random test? Okay, so let me ask you a question. You get called into court because B tests positive and challenges you, and the attorney asks you, why did you do testing? Well, we do random testing. Oh, that's wonderful. Would you mind producing for us the scientifically generated random selection list that has A, B, and C's name on it? And what are you doing right now? Because what don't you have? You don't have documentation. What did you really do? It was a reasonable suspicion test. It wasn't random. So don't lie. Just call it what it is. Okay? But I've had that happen more than one occasion, which is kind of funny. It's like, okay, yeah, we can come out and do this, but if we do this and this is what happens, what are you going to do? How about cocaine? Sedative or stimulant? Stimulant. So what's it do? Heart rate goes, blood pressure goes, activity level goes up. How long does a high last? 20 to 90 minutes. Oh, it's in there. Okay, all right. Wow, people are just reading. I thought I knew something you didn't, all right? So it's in and out. So a person who's doing cocaine is up and down frequently throughout the day, right? If they're using rabbit, turtle, rabbit, turtle. If they can't afford cocaine, they turn to crack cocaine, all right? So hallucinations, mood swings, ups and downs, weight loss, all associated with the use of cocaine. If somebody walks in and they got white powder on the underside of their nose, what's the first thing you're going to look for? Exactly, a bag of powdered donuts. If you don't find the powdered donuts, you might be concerned that it's not sugar, all right? If somebody's walking around, they got that long pinky nail and everything else is nicely manicured, what are they saying? Why do they do that? That's a snort, or that's a scoop. Just scoop a little bit and snort. It's the only real reason that that fingernail is probably kept long. Supervisors pay attention to those kind of things. Amphetamines, methamphetamine, ecstasy. Are there legal amphetamines? Can you give me an example? Ritalin, Adderall. What else? Pseudoephedrine, sinus medications, nasal decongestants, things of that nature. So please understand that for a medication to be a legitimate reason for a positive drug test means that the person or the prescription must be in the person's name. It must be in date. They must be using it by recommended dosages. If you use somebody else's prescription medication, what's that considered? Could be a Class C felony, and it would probably result in a positive drug test. Does the production of methamphetamine produce any kind of dangers? Exactly. How many of you are familiar with something called shake and bake? Okay, now are you thinking about the chicken and pork stuff and I helped? Okay, because it's not that stuff, all right? What is shake and bake? Making meth in a 2-liter Coke bottle, right. What's the dangers of making meth in a 2-liter Coke bottle? It's very volatile. I watched a video once and somebody dropped the bottle and it started spinning around by itself. The officer said, the minute you see that, run. And within 5 seconds it blew up and threw a wall of fire about 6 foot high and 6 foot out. It's very volatile. They have to burp it periodically. All right? So if you hear somebody talking about shake and bake, or you start finding a lot of 2-liter bottles laying around and you're like, what's going on here? There could be some cooking. It's also toxic. So you got some issues with that. Does methamphetamine use change a person's appearance? Yeah. Do they lose weight very rapidly? Sores all over their body? Things of that nature? Absolutely. Excessive tooth decay. What's unique about tooth decay with methamphetamine that's different from normal tooth decay? It gets all the teeth. What else? It happens rapidly. It also starts from the bottom up. I've had dental professionals tell me they'll be working on somebody who's had meth mouth and the teeth will just snap off at the gum line because it rots everything from the inside out. Oh, how many of you are familiar, I got to word this the right way. How many of you have seen a crack pipe? Okay. I didn't want to make sure. How many of you have ever had occasion to have a crack? I won't ask that question that way, okay? But you've seen a crack pipe, so it's usually made out of glass. So another telltale sign that somebody could be using a crack pipe, circular burn marks on the tips of their fingers, because they're putting their hole over top of that to draw the fumes through. So those are some telltale signs as well. And they'll grind their teeth. So as you're talking to somebody, if their mouth is just moving back and forth, or if they're chewing and gnawing away on the inside of their gum or their tongue, that could be an indication they're coming down. My wife and I stopped at a little roadside burger joint one day, and where you can watch them cook and do all that kind of stuff. Well, after we ordered our burgers and we're sitting there waiting for it, she gives me one of these things. I said, what? She said, look at the guy cooking. I said, what are you talking about? She said, watch his mouth. The whole time he was cooking, I mean, just chawing away on his tongue and on the inside of his mouth, and it wasn't tobacco. Well, we ate our burgers and we left, and for the rest of the afternoon, we actually felt pretty invigorated. We weren't quite sure why, but it was a nice little stop. But those can be telltale signs. The sensation a meth addict gets is that they got bugs crawling underneath their skin. So when you see the open sores, yes, ma'am. Oh, the tennis balls? I was sitting in a session with a former vice detective, and he said a mother came to him one day and said, I found a tennis ball in my son's dresser as I was putting stuff away. Said, should I be concerned? And he said, go home and bump it or shake it. He said, you might be surprised what you find, because they'll use it as a place to hide their drugs. They can take a razor blade, cut a little bit of on the seam, squeeze it, produces a cavity, drop their drugs down in there, take the pressure off, and it looks like a tennis ball. So he said, if you find it in an odd, unique place, do those things. He says it may give a whole new meaning to the term stress ball, was his indication, his joke. So that's why that's in there. Appreciate you asking. No. I'm amazed people are actually reading the slides. That's so cool. All right, so back to the crank bugs. They get the sensation they got bugs crawling underneath their skin. So if you're outside at a picnic and you get a bug crawl on you, what's your first reaction? Slap it away. You get that sensation underneath your skin, what are you going to do? You're going to scratch, you're going to pick at it. So they're often trying to pick those bugs off. They're not there, but they're very real. And I've got a couple friends who are former meth addicts, and they're like, oh yeah, I was constantly picking at my face trying to get those bugs off. Opiates. Now, codeine, morphine, and heroin. That's what's in a standard opiate panel. I've got a slide on this, but I'll jump ahead. Let you know that this week, DOT passed a final rule, and they are now adding 4 opioids to a federal drug panel. So now in a DOT drug test, besides morphine, codeine, and heroin, you also get oxycodone, hydrocodone, oxymorphone, and hydromorphone, which is long overdue. And in turn, that's probably going to have an impact on a lot of companies' drug and alcohol testing programs. We see some company policies that say we're going to follow federal guidelines. So those drugs are going to be added to a federal drug test, and in probably many, if it's not already there, a lot of companies' drug-free workplace testing. Why is that important? Well, it's crazy. What's this thing? Oh, there's an article, and you can come up and read this. It talks about opioids. And this article happens to go through and list the different strength of pain pills as it relates to morphine. Now, you think about morphine, you're thinking about a pretty powerful painkiller, right? I think they said here, hydrocodone is the same strength as morphine. Oxycodone is 50% stronger than morphine. Heroin can be 2 to 5 times stronger than morphine. Buprenorphine, 40 times stronger than morphine. Fentanyl, how many of you heard of fentanyl? Fentanyl patches and everything? 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. And that's becoming an increasing issue. And then carfentanil, anybody heard of that? What's it used for? It's an elephant tranquilizer. It can be 10,000 times stronger than morphine. They did not put fentanyl in there. No. Matter of fact, a lot of those pain pills, yes ma'am. That's a great question. It depends on the drug. I mean, when we've studied like in a urine drug test, it's usually detectable for about 1 to 3 days is usually where most pain pills. But the impact, there's a lot of different factors, but mostly in a drug test, have you ever heard of somebody called a medical review officer, an MRO? Okay. For those of you drug testing, MRO is a familiar term? Okay. Generally what happens is at the time of the collection, the collector is not going to ask you what medications you're taking because it's really not their job. They're just there to collect the specimen, do the work. The laboratory doesn't want to know. They're just doing the analysis. But the medical review officer's job is to have a conversation with you should something show up in your drug test. And they're going to ask you to produce medications you're taking, and they're trying to determine do you have a legitimate explanation as to why that drug is in your system. Exactly. Yeah, that's what the non-negative means. It's going for confirmation, and then once it comes back from the lab from confirmation, it may still go to the medical review officer to determine the valid explanation. Now, one of the things, and this is again going back to prescription medications, and I don't know what company policies do, but one of the jobs of an MRO is to also evaluate the medications that have been told to them. So if, for example, I'm taking a medication that has a performance inhibiting factor attributed to it, but he verifies everything, I got a legitimate script, it all checks out, so he deems that as a negative test. He also has a responsibility and often puts at the bottom of that test result, donor disclosed the use of medications that could have a performance inhibiting factor attributed to them or may impair their ability to perform certain duties, so therefore light duty should be considered. Something along that line. Okay, the question was a lot of smaller companies don't have an MRO, so how in the world do you get set up with one? If I can just use us for an example. As a company, we are contracted with an HHS certified laboratory. We're also contracted with an MRO. So part of our offerings, if you were to come and say, hey, we want to do a drug test, okay, we want that non-negative go for confirmation, but we'll also say then, do you want the MRO to review those results, either for all results or at least for positives. So it can be contracted through us, and it's a relatively inexpensive way. So you can contract through your provider. He said, what are the qualifications for an MRO? If you're looking at a federal MRO, Part 40 of the federal regulations list out all the qualifications. I think they either have to be an MD or a DO. They have to go through a certain number of hours of training plus some continual refresher training, and they have to be basically approved to meet all the DOT training requirements. So those are the types of MROs that we would recommend that people use. They're specialists who focus on drug usage and how that impacts a person, and also through the verification process. Unless the provider that they're using has contracted with an MRO that meets that qualification. Yeah. And I would say most, and at least my experience is, most of the legitimate drug and alcohol testing companies are going to have some type of relationship with an MRO. Number one, because it's mandated under federal guidelines. So they've got to have that relationship. So not that hard to come up with a good MRO. But great question. Yes? There are a couple industry organizations. One's called DATIA, D-A-T-I-A. And you can go to DATIA's website, and they can list the companies that have gone through their training or have joined their groupings. Another one, SAPA, S-A-P-A-A, Substance Abuse Program Administrators Association, I think. So there's websites like that. You can go to sometimes the laboratory itself, like Quest Diagnostics or Lear, and they might have a list of the collection facilities that they're contracted with. As an employer, and this is something that's important, especially if you fall under federal testing guidelines, the regulations say that it's your responsibility to verify the qualifications of your service agents. So, basically, if you hire us as a company that does drug collections, do our collectors meet the training requirements set forth under Part 40 of the federal regulations to do drug and or alcohol collections? If you have a laboratory that you send your specimens to, is it an HHS certified laboratory that's on the list that the Federal Register puts out? Same thing with the doctors that might do your DOT physicals and stuff like that. Are you using an MRO that's gone through those training qualifications? That's technically your responsibility as an employer. I used to say this a lot. It's your job as an employer to make sure that I'm doing my job right. Technically that is. But that's why they issued those PIEs, public interest exclusions, within our industry, so that if somebody's not doing their job, they can actually be slapped with this PIE and lose their ability to provide certain DOT functions for drug and alcohol testing. Absolutely. Absolutely. If you're setting up, if you do all your drug testing in-house and you call a clinic and ask them to do drug testing for you, if you need federal drug testing done, then you can ask them to send the training certificates of those who have done collections. I used to do this. I used to get calls from clinics to say, hey, can we do collections for you? Yeah, sure. Would you mind sending us your training certification certificate showing that you've gone through the appropriate training for DOT drug and alcohol collections? I'm pausing for effect. Awkward silence. The minute I got that awkward silence, I knew they had no idea what I was talking about. And I said, you don't have those, do you? No, I'm sorry, you can't do collections for us then. So yeah, you can ask for that information to be provided, and your service agent should be able to provide all that information. We often are sometimes asked to get that verification from our MRO so we can provide to some clients. Same thing with our laboratories. And then we have all certification certificates for all of our staff that meet DOT training requirements. Any service agent should have that. There are 6 different DOT administrations. Each one has its own guidelines and tells you when or you won't. The main one that most of us fall under would be Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which means you've got Class A or Class B CDL drivers, and you're operating vehicles that are rated to carry 26,001 pounds or more, 16 passengers or more, or has to have a hazmat placard. And so if you don't have any of that, the only way you might be federally mandated is if you operate and do federal contracts. Then there might be some federal testing that you have to do. I don't think it goes for. I honestly haven't gotten into that much on the federal contracts. Most people who fall under federal contracts know they do because they're like contractors doing contracted work. I don't think it has to do just with getting Medicare payments. And correct me if I'm wrong. It's something I've not researched. Good questions. What else? All righty. Heroin's on a comeback. So you see some issues with heroin and coming back for about the last 3 years. We've seen heroin have a real growing impact in a lot of communities. How does it affect employees? It's going to cause them to be drowsy. It's going to cause them not to be able to really respond very well, to react very well. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of companies are expanding their opiate panels in their drug testing programs in order to make sure that they're protecting the safety in the workplace. Poppy seeds. Somebody has some was there poppy seed muffins over there? No? Okay. Somebody has a poppy seed muffin or some poppy seed dressing. Is it going to impact their drug test? They did a study, or I was at a seminar, and I asked the scientist, I said, average guy eats a poppy seed muffin, my size. How many opiates am I getting in my system? He said between 50 to 90 nanograms. Well, the federal cutoff level is 2,000. So if I got to get to 2,000 by eating muffins that have 50 to 90 nanograms per muffin, giddy up. Okay, I got to get some work done. All right, and this was the DOT final rule that I mentioned, goes into effect January 1. All right, anybody ever heard of PCP? Anybody ever been around somebody while they've been high on PCP? It's a dissociative drug, considered a Superman drug. Somebody might have 2 to 5 times their normal strength. It was used as a tranquilizer for large animals for a while, so they virtually feel no pain. So you got somebody who's 2 to 5 times their normal strength, out of their mind, and very, very aggressive and violent, don't feel a thing. You get in a fight with that person, what's going to happen? You can just beat the fire out of them, they're going to keep coming. Had a friend of mine who was an ER trauma nurse. Officers brought in a fellow who had two broken legs, a broken arm, multiple stab wounds strung out on PCP. Got him in the ER. He jumped up off the gurney, fought off the officers, fought off the medical personnel, and then tried to run out of the trauma unit on 2 broken legs. Officers are trained that if they do a stop and they do a nystagmus test where they put that finger out about a foot, they see those eyes jittering back and forth, they're trained to take 3 steps backwards and reach for their weapon, because they know that person can go off just like that, and once the fight starts, it's not going to stop until they either, well, one guy told me that he hit a guy so hard with a frying pan it knocked him out. But I've had officers tell me they've tased people 2 or 3 times, no impact. I've had officers tell me they've shot them 6, 7 times, no impact, because they don't feel a thing unless they hit a vital and kill them. So it's a very, very dangerous drug included in most drug tests. The K2, the bath salts, these are unique tests. You familiar with K2, a synthetic cannabinoid? All right, it's a chemical that was designed to stimulate the cannabinoid receptors of the brain. It's not found or not included in a standard drug test. You can ask for K2 to be tested, and at the best laboratories, you'll get about 35 to 40 different versions of it. There could be as many as 400 to 500 floating around. They take the ones that are the most common, and they'll include those in the test. It can have a very detrimental impact. Again, no regulation, so a mild high to going out of their mind. What's worse are the bath salts, because they're synthetic cathinones. They act like the methamphetamine. They act like the cocaine. Again, you can include them in tests, but you have to ask for it specifically. One of the worst things that bath salts do is they increase your body temperature. So what's happening to your brain if your body temperature is between 106 to 108 degrees? It's cooking. Have you seen that commercial they're trying to resurrect from a long time ago where they put a frying pan on a stove and they show you an egg and say, this is your brain, and they crack the egg and put it in the frying pan and say, this is your brain on drugs? Okay, that's exactly what it's happening. The brain is cooking or inside the skull when the drugs get up that high. Have you ever seen commercials or things on police shows where the person's running down the street in the middle of the winter and they're stripping off all their clothes and they might be running butt naked? Their body temperature is so hot they can't stand the touch of clothing against their skin, and that's why they're stripping them off. Usually some type of stimulant. All right, so what are the trends? The oral fluid testing. Just make you aware. How many of you are familiar with saliva or oral fluid testing? Hands? Okay. Now, it's an opportunity, again, to do testing. The accuracy of laboratory-based saliva testing is the same as urine laboratory testing. We feel very, very comfortable for the last 3 years. The feds approved oral fluid testing for federal employees. Some of DOT is considered as a backup if somebody can't go to the bathroom after 3 hours. You just have to understand the strengths and the weaknesses. It's always an observed collection. You're sitting there watching the person with the device in their mouth. So it takes away that opportunity to adulterate the specimen, like with urine where you have to send them in the bathroom and so forth. Because how many of you do observed collections for your urine drug test? That's what I thought, okay? And I guarantee you, least favorite part of our job is collectors. So oral fluid testing, you don't have to worry about it. You're sitting there watching them. So it takes away the opportunity for tampering. It is a very short window of detection, so it can be an indicator of more recent usage. Not quite as many drugs in an oral fluid test as in a saliva, but a pretty good number. So again, that's probably the growing trend has been for the last 3 years. The other trend is what we've been talking about sporadically, medications, prescription medications. Specifically, what does your policy say about an employee who is using a legitimately prescribed medication that has a performance inhibiting factor to it? I've read a lot of policies that say nothing, or they say that an employee has to take that medication to their supervisor, who then decides what to do with them. How many of you in here are HR professionals? All right. Do you want your supervisors being told the medications your employees are taking? Okay. So you see the problem with having that in your policy? So what do? You get with your attorneys and say, how are we going to word this? And it's a growing issue because prescription medication use and abuse is an extremely growing issue within our area, especially with the pain pills. You're going to have to address it. If they ever drop marijuana to a Schedule II drug, now you're prepared, or at least stronger preparing for it. Make sense? All right, as far as your policy, understand the employer and the employee both share responsibilities for that. Does your policy need to be compliant with both state and federal regulations, or just federal? If you have federal and state, then you should have a policy, what we call a drug-free workplace policy, that's an umbrella over all companies or all employees. Your drug-free workplace policy specifies your employer-employee relationship. If you violate our policy, these are the consequences. A DOT-specific policy only impacts a person's ability to drive in a safety-sensitive fashion. So what happens if I fail a federal drug test? That means I can't drive as a commercial motor vehicle, or I can't drive a commercial motor vehicle as a CDL driver. Does it mean I lose my job? DOT doesn't get into that. That's where your drug-free workplace policy comes into play. The one thing we would highly suggest, don't mix your policies. Don't try to come up with one policy that says, well, this is drug-free workplace and DOT and da-da-da-da. Have separate policies, or at least separate addendums, so it's very clear, because definitions can be different, covered employees can be different, a lot of factors come into play. How many of you are government entities? Okay, as a government entity, the rules change for you. You are only allowed to randomly test individuals that you assign to be in safety-sensitive positions, where John Q. Employer can test everybody. So know where the rules are different and how they apply. I had one county tell me, they called and said, we want to test everybody, including the commissioners. Can I make a recommendation? Sure. Don't. You know, you can't test elected officials. We don't care. We're going to do it. All right, your call. I warned you. So, could they get challenged on that? Absolutely. But, you know how these government people are, and they're so bullheaded sometimes. I'm not getting any laughs out of that one, so I'll just move on. All right. So you're defining who's eligible for testing. Under what circumstances are you going to test? Now, you look up there, I got pre, random, post-accident, reasonable suspicion. Those are the most common reasons for testing. 2 are reactive, 2 are proactive. Pre-employment, reactive or proactive? Proactive. Random testing, reactive or proactive? Proactive. So the other 2, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, are reactive. Most companies have a reactive policy. They will test after accidents. They will test after suspicion. They may do pre-employment, but what's the one that's usually left out? Random testing. And yet, combined with pre-employment, probably one of the more effective tools in helping not only prevent the incidents from happening, but holding people accountable periodically. So that can be done. What does your policy say regarding violations and consequences? They need to be well-defined. They need to be consistently applied. When I first started doing this, a lot of the companies, they would start doing testing, and a management level person would test positive. And I'm like, oh, we don't want to lose that person, so we'll let them go through rehab, but the person who just started 2 days ago, we'll fire them. Issue? Absolutely. So policy's got to be consistent across the board. People have to be educated very, very well. And then, are you going to offer an employee assistance program? Yes or no? If so, what are the terms? It should be very defined and very spelled out. You don't have to offer one unless you're a government entity, and then you probably should. Other than that, it's up to you. I'd say at one time, a large amount of companies were doing it. Now I'm seeing it less and less. If you violate this policy, you're terminated. That's just what their company policy is. So, know what your custody and control procedures are. Know who your collectors are. If you know what a chain of custody is, make sure it's a good laboratory. Make sure it's a good MRO, things like that. Are you going to use urine? Are you going to use saliva? Are you going to use hair testing? Are you going to do something different? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? If you are under contract or have a collection provider, ask them those questions. They each have real good strengths, and they also have limitations, and you need to know what it is. A lot of people say, well, why didn't this drug test work? Well, because what you were testing for and what the person was using weren't consistent, or the methodology didn't allow for that to be picked up. We talked about the drugs to include, the state laws, the circumstances, locations. Do you send everybody to a clinic? If you do, who follows them down there? Is on-site testing available for you? If so, are there providers that can do that? For some companies, that can be a real benefit. Training. What are your training requirements? Do you train your supervisors for drug and alcohol recognition training? Do you have certificates showing they've gone through that training? You can document the material. Federal regulations say that supervisors of safety-sensitive employees must go through at least 60 minutes of drug recognition training and 60 minutes of alcohol recognition training for the purpose of reasonable suspicion testing. In Iowa, you have to do an hour refresher training every year. In Missouri, that's not required. What's your company policy say? We suggest that you refresh at least every 2 to 4 years, that you know what your company policy is. When you make an observation, how do you confront the person? What do you say? What don't you say? Do you have a reasonable suspicion documentation form that all your supervisors know where it's at, and you use it consistently across the board for your reasonable suspicion? Those are available. And then how are you going to get the testing done? All questions that we recommend you get in place before you do reasonable suspicion testing, not when or after it happens. So you have to have your company policy. A supervisor needs to know what to look for. Remember that you're there to confront and you're documenting. Reasonable suspicion. You don't have to be a drug recognition expert. All right? Don't make it an accusation. I thought you told me you were going to lay off the bottle. Come on, Karen. How much did you drink this time? What's that weed? I mean, that smell. Have you been using that wacky tobacco again? What have I just done to Karen? I've labeled her. What else? I've accused you. Do I know Karen's conduct without a shadow of a doubt is because she has taken some type of drug or drank alcohol? Do I? No. Could she be demonstrating characteristics, say, for example, that were consistent with alcohol usage that had absolutely nothing to do with consuming alcohol? And what might she be having? Exactly, a diabetic reaction. So there again, you don't make it an accusation. You don't have to identify the specific drug. Well, I think that you probably drank about 3 cans of beer, and I think you're taking 500 milligrams of whatever. That's not your job. You're just looking for characteristics. And you're not there to offer a diagnosis. For drug usage, possession of, usage of, or a pattern of abnormal behavior. We're assuming the picture might be abnormal for your workplace. I don't know. If you walk around the corner of your work and this is what you see, do you have specific concerns? Are they happening right now? Can you write down what your concerns are? Then you have specific, contemporaneous, articulable characteristics to do a reasonable suspicion test. So the bottom line, drug and alcohol testing is like any other testing program or safety program. How many of you have certain pieces of equipment that before an employee ever uses them, they are expected to go through a set safety protocol both before, during, and after the usage? Okay? When we do supervisor drug and alcohol recognition training, we tell the supervisors the same thing. Reasonable suspicion testing is one of your safety tools. And just as you would expect one of your employees to use it, we expect you to use reasonable suspicion when the situation, if it ever does arise. Does that make sense? All right, I want to respect my time. Thank you very much. Enjoyed the session. Thank you for your participation.